Thank you so much. That was so kind. I thank you, Vicki. Thank you. Well, welcome everyone. I'm so excited that you're all here today. We've got some brave souls in the splash zone up front, so thank you. I always love seeing a couple people in the front row. So what we're talking about today, as Vicki mentioned, we're talking about recruiting diversity. Let's get tangible. And you know, what's really important for me when we think about getting tangible is moving from the why to the how. So that's really what today is all about. I'm going to get you to have some discussions. We're really going to try to leave here with an action plan so we can get out there and better engage high-quality, diverse candidates. Before we do that, I want to share 3 stories with you. And these 3 stories are really pivotal moments in my life that really led me to this stage today and led me to the career that I'm in. So the first story was back when I was in university, or as we call it down here, college, and a friend of mine came out to me, which, you know, in any other scenario would be a joyous occasion. I'd be so excited for her, we'd chat about it, and we'd move on. But what she said next to me really hit me. She said, you know, I've been dating a woman for several years, and I'm sorry I didn't tell you yet, which she did not have to apologize for. And she said, because I didn't think he would understand. Now that hit me like a freight train. I've always prided myself on being an ally, on being open and incredibly accepting, but something I was doing had made her felt like I wouldn't understand her true self. Clearly, I had some work to do. So my next story takes me to my master's degree. And I was a year away from a very serious concussion that I suffered playing sports that led to a couple mental health issues that I was working through. So a night before a huge meeting with one of my professors, my supervisor actually, I had my first ever panic attack. If anyone's had one before, if you hadn't had one prior to that, you think you're having a heart attack. So I marched myself to the emergency room. Luckily, it was just down the street. And I spent the evening in the emergency room. I was there all night. I woke up drained, exhausted, in pain. I dragged myself to my meeting, thinking, you know, it's 2013. Mental health stigma doesn't exist anymore, right? I'm going to share this with my supervisor and let her know why I couldn't do the work I was supposed to do. So I shared it with her. I said, you know, I had my first panic attack last night. I'm working through some anxiety. I couldn't get my work done. Deadpan. She looks at me and says, well, guess you're not cut out for this. Ooh. Again, hit me like a freight train. Clearly, she had a little bit of work to do. So, my next story brings me to my first job where I was working in recruiting, and I was recruiting for a class of 150 people. And we only had about a month and a half to do it. So it was very intense, so we decided to set up carousel hiring. I don't know if you've heard of carousel hiring, but basically it's just you bring in a big group of people at the same time and you have them go through different activities and then you have people watch them and evaluate them as they do that. So I was keen, I was creative, I was excited to come up with some new activities. So I came up with one where it was a team working, team building activity, and they would pop balloons that would give them pieces of a puzzle that they had to solve, and they'd go through it. And I thought it'd be, you know, active, they'd be up and moving around, it'd be great. Fun activity, right? Not the case. It just so happened that in our first carousel, we had a candidate with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. So popping of balloons actually led her to experience horrific flashbacks, and we basically had to cancel the entire carousel and start from scratch. Clearly, as a team, we really had some work to do. So I share these examples with you to show you that first of all, we're all learning. No one is perfect. We're always going to have work to do, but every time we can improve a little bit, we're going to reduce a barrier for somebody. So no one ever feels like they can't be their true selves because someone won't understand. So no one ever feels like they just aren't cut out for what they love and what they want to do because of something they didn't ask for. And so no one ever legitimately has a horrific hiring experience. So I really want you to keep that in the back of your minds as we go through our session today. It's all about learning. It's all about getting out there and learning about how other people experience the world and how other people are going to experience our hiring process because of that. So I know what you're thinking. Another freaking diversity workshop. How many of these can we do? I know. I've been to many myself. Show of hands, who here has been to a diversity workshop before? Yeah, that sounds about right. And they're all great. I really believe that they're all valuable, but I also believe that we can't stop talking about it. But what are we actually doing about it? I talk to so many organizations again and again, and they say, we know why it's important, we know why we should be doing this, but we just can't figure out how. So that, again, is exactly what we're doing today. We're going to do a little bit on the why, just so you guys have a tiny refresher, but we are going to really get into how. We're going to get tangible. We're going to get past that sort of 40,000 feet high-level diversity stuff, and we're really going to dig in to what you can do Thursday when you get back in the office, or if you're lucky next week, if you took a couple extra days off. When you get back in the office, things you can do right away to improve your ability to recruit diversity. So with that, quick 3 objectives today. You would have seen these in your program. We're going to identify and reduce barriers. That's a really, really big, important piece when it comes to recruiting diversity. Next, we're going to talk about the needs of different groups that we're actually recruiting for today. So I'm going to ask you to think about groups that you want to engage in your hiring process, and we're going to walk through how we're going to do that. And then lastly, I really want you to leave with an action plan. So hopefully you've got stuff to write on. We have 1,000 pens in the back if you need one. Lots left over. But I really want you to leave with an action plan for every step of your process throughout. And as I mentioned, I'm going to ask you to have a couple discussions with your neighbors. I'm going to make some weird noises likely to get you back focused on me once you're done your discussion, so prepare yourselves for that. But hopefully we can get some interactivity into this and really do some good learning. So before we get into the actual tangible stuff, I want to go through my favorite definition of diversity and inclusion. So we really know the difference between the two because they often get intertwined and they often get used sort of in the same sentence. So Verna Myers is a consultant. If you haven't heard of her, I highly recommend tonight before you go to bed, watch her TED Talk. It is unbelievable. She's incredible. And her definition is that diversity is being invited to the party and inclusion is being asked to dance. And really all that means is diversity is who gets an invitation. So what is the makeup of the people who are invited to this party? But inclusion is who is actually dancing at the party. So if we think back, let's say 40 years back, organizations were incredibly inclusive because everybody was the same. And everybody was hiring their buddy from the golf course or hiring someone they played sports with. And they all felt very welcome because they all looked exactly the same. They all thought the same. And things like the Challenger crash happened because of groupthink. So we don't want just inclusion because great, everybody feels like they can be their authentic selves, but we don't have any difference in opinions. We don't have any difference in thought, background, anything like that. What if we only have diversity? And I'm going to say about 15 years ago, this is when diversity really came to the forefront. And we started talking about, okay, making sure we have representative organizations, we want diverse groups involved in everything and part of the hiring process. But I don't think we were really there with inclusion. So there was tokenism that happened. That's when sort of affirmative action started getting a really negative connotation to it because people were being hired just for the sake of diversity. And then they'd get to the organization and they wouldn't feel included in any way. They wouldn't feel like they could be their authentic selves. Their opinions weren't cared for. So we don't want that. What we really want is both. We need to have a diverse makeup of everybody at the party, but everyone needs to feel comfortable dancing. Today we're focusing on diversity. So we're going to focus on the front end because I really think that recruiting plays an incredibly critical part in getting those invitations out to everybody who needs to be at this party. And then once we get them in the organization, we can make them feel included. So let's think about what diversity actually means. A lot of organizations have a narrow definition of diversity, mainly because of EOC or any of what your legislative bodies in your countries ask you to report back to them about your representation. So we've got things like race, things like gender, We've got sometimes Aboriginal status is a big thing in Canada, but it's narrow. So let's talk about why we need to expand it and what that's going to show us when it comes to our actual metrics. So first off, we're going to improve organizational performance. We have a huge client, a multinational retailer, and 7 years ago they set out on a path to improve their diversity in their organization using recruitment strategies. 7 years. It was a long project, but they actually doubled their profits, holding all other variables constant. I've never seen anything like it. It was unbelievable, and their number one goal was to represent the markets in which we operate. And that's what they focused on, and they built strategies around it, and they doubled their profits, way exceeded their growth targets. And then what about better representing the markets? As I said, that's what they wanted to do. We want to serve our markets with a representation of our markets. If we think about generations, so by 2025, data shows that millennials will make up probably half of the workforce and the working population. Generation Z, coming behind us millennials, will make up about a quarter of that. So 75% of the organizations that we work in and the markets we work in are going to represent those two generations. We need to be ready for that. We need to be ready to best represent them and best bring them onto our organizations. Now the next two, improving decision-making and stimulating innovation. So I did my thesis on team decision-making and how adding a diverse person into a group could improve decision-making. And I hypothesized that it would create something called good conflict, which is task conflict. So it's people having different thoughts, different ideas, different ways of making decisions to bring to the group. But I didn't go with your standard categories of diversity. I picked everyone's favorite personality trait about millennials. I picked entitlement. Right. I know. I'm a millennial, so you can make fun of me. It's fine. So I picked entitlement, and what I did was I put one person who was entitled in a team with everybody else who scored low on an entitlement assessment. And I said, I think people might not like it, but this group is going to make a better decision because the person is different than everybody else in the group. And that's going to generate good task conflict. And it did. And entitlement is something that we think is very negative, but in this scenario, it actually created more diversity of thought and a better decision at the end. So it really improved the decision-making overall, and it stimulated innovation in their decisions that they made. And then lastly, of course, one of the most important things, especially in recruitment, is we want to create a desirable employment brand that is authentic. So we're not just putting the little statement at the bottom of our job description saying, we love diversity, it's really important to us. We want to show it. A study that was done, I believe it was in 2016, they actually surveyed candidates who had had experiences with different large brands. And of everyone who said they had had a negative hiring experience, 12% said they would share that on social media. So just think about that. 1 out of 10 is going to go to social media and blast your company for their terrible experience. Not great. And people love complaining on social media, so it's not going to be positive. And then 33% said they would share it with their immediate contacts. So we're looking at 45% of the people who've had a negative experience with an employment brand are going to share that wide enough that you're probably going to lose candidates and you're probably going to lose customers. So it's really, really important that we create an authentic employer brand that speaks to everyone in our markets, not just a subset, and we want to always focus on giving them that positive experience. So let's go back to these dimensions of organizational diversity that I briefly mentioned. Often we're very narrowly defining diversity, again, because that's what we have to report back. So we've got the basics, race, gender identity, if you identify as a person with a disability, and age. Much like the lovely Chicago skyline in this slide, there's a lot more in here. Socioeconomic status, big piece of diversity, especially in the world we are in today. Identifying as a member of the LGBTQIA plus community now. We've got veteran status, big piece. Family status, so if people are single, if they're married, if they're new parents, whatever that looks like. Caring for aging parents is another really big group that we're dealing with now. Language spoken, particularly first language spoken, that can add some really interesting diversity to organizations. And diversity of thought. That's one of my favorites. Thinking about bringing in different thinking and different ways of approaching problems and problem solving can be a really, really, really big part of improving your organization's diversity. And there's way more, way, way, way more than this. And if you think about how your organization right now is defining diversity, we'd be hard-pressed to find an organization that has this definition that's so broad, that really brings in all these interesting dimensions of what we can do when we create diverse organizations. And it's also multidimensional. So people are going to be part of many different groups at once, right? They're not just sort of in a silo and part of one dimension of diversity. You know, I'm a millennial, and I'm also a woman, and I also think differently than people around me, and things like that. So keep in mind, as we go through today's exercises, I don't want you to just be focusing on what you can see when it comes to diversity. I really want you to focus on every little piece of it, and that'll help us sort of broaden our ability to recruit high-quality, diverse candidates. So this is the challenge. The challenge that we face in our organizations today is how to attract and engage high-quality candidates from diverse groups. Would people agree with me that that's a bit of a struggle in your organizations? Yes, I hope so. You're here. So something drew this to you, so that makes sense. And you'll notice that I didn't say hiring high-quality, diverse candidates. And that's very intentional. When we think about hiring diverse candidates, we're too late in the process. We're talking about when we're working with our hiring managers and they just won't hire our diverse candidates that we want them to hire. It's too late. It's too late at that point. We need to focus on attracting and engaging at the front end, and we need to focus on attracting and engaging high-quality candidates. It's not just diversity for the sake of it. It's high quality, and we've got to do it right at the front. Because once we get to the point where we're down to 3 candidates and one's diverse, and the hiring manager doesn't pick them, it's not their fault. It was our fault that we didn't get a high-quality candidate at the front end to be there at the end. So we really need to think about the front end, and we always need to focus on quality. If you think about recruiting as a funnel, we've got, our top piece, which is where we source and we post and we try and get, the best pipeline we can. And then we move as we go down. So, simple math tells us that the more high-quality, diverse candidates we have up here, the better chance they're going to have down here. The better chance they're going to have consistently at getting the job. So that's really our challenge today. Seems simple enough, right? So why don't we have a solution yet? And I think there are a lot of reasons for that, none of which are your fault, I promise. But it comes into 2 areas. So I like talking about, our strategic level, our 40,000 feet, and then we get down to our tactical level. So at the strategic level, alignment. I'm sure you all have headaches about alignment every night before you go to bed after work. Alignment is not easy in siloed organizations, in big organizations, and it's really hard to align every piece of the puzzle to actually make a picture and make something work. Next, resources. Budgets are shrinking, staff is shrinking, everyone's trying to do more with less. So it's really, really hard to actually get the resources to be able to go through these big initiatives to actually increase your ability to recruit diverse candidates. Buy-in. This is my favorite one. Everyone knows it's important, but when it comes to actually buying into it, they're not that excited about it. So that's a really big piece, and getting buy-in from every aligned resource is also another issue. Consistency. Change only sticks if it's consistent across. So when we make a change and it doesn't get consistently implemented, it falls flat. And then lastly, ROI. There have been tons of sessions this week about how to, speak to the business and talk about how you're actually improving the bottom line. And it's really hard to do when it comes to diversity because it's so multidimensional, and it's really hard to measure if we're not just measuring the 4 or 5 things that we report back to our legislation. So that's tough. We know that's tough. But today, we're going to pretend that in a perfect world, the strategic stuff is getting dealt with. And we're going to focus on the tactical level, because this is where I really feel HR professionals can make a difference and move what's happening at the strategic level if we start showing gains and benefits at the tactical level where we operate a lot. So first off, with sourcing and attraction. So that's the top of our funnel. And that's really generating a pipeline. That's all we're doing. So we're doing whatever we can to generate a diverse pipeline. And then we get down to the next piece of the funnel, screening. And I think about screening as asking, do I have a candidate? So you're not asking anything else. You're just saying, is this person a candidate for this job? Do they meet the minimum qualifications to be considered for this job? Then we get to the next piece, selection. And this is when we look at the candidates that we said, yes, they meet the requirements. Now we look at how good are these candidates. So of the people who meet it, we look at quality. So we're really trying to figure out who is the best person. And then we get to decision making. And this is where all the other stakeholders get involved, and it gets much more exciting. And this is when we decide this is our candidate. And then lastly, a piece that often gets forgotten when we do diversity and when we do recruiting training, it's if the candidate says yes or no. And that's a really big focus that I want to hit on today when we get to this stage, because we can do everything we can all the way up to that part, and then the candidate says no. And all of our efforts up to there to get this high-quality, diverse candidate into our pipeline, get them through, convince the hiring manager that this person's the one, and then they decline and go somewhere else. So we're going to talk about how to get a yes and why that's really important for us to show ROI on our efforts and also for us to move the dial. So where we can start. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start with 3 foundational things that if you do anything when you get back to work, I want you to think about these 3 foundational items. And they're all about the tactical level. So first off, reducing barriers. And I'll get into really what that means, but that's number 1. We've got to get into our process, dig into it, and find ways to reduce barriers for high-quality, diverse candidates. Next, we're going to work on being intentional. As everyone knows, I'm going to say this many times today, recruitment is reactive. It has to be. We have a process to follow. We have seats to fill when they empty. We forecast for seats we have to fill. It's all reactive. So we need to find a way to be intentional within the bounds of that reactive system. And then lastly, we need to measure. Recruitment is very, very busy. I used to be a recruiter for a very long time. I feel the pain, but we need to find ways to measure what we're doing and measure what I like to call our return on effort. So not just our return on our investments, but the return I get on my effort every day and the return I get on the hours I put in. Am I really seeing a return on that? And if I'm not, I need to find a better way. So let's get into it. Reducing barriers. So we're going to think about your entire recruitment process. So picture it in your head, your nice little funnel. I'm going to ask you some questions. And I want you to raise your hand if the answer to the question is yes. Ready? Okay. It's going to be tough, I promise. If English was not my first language, would I have a fair chance in your process? Hands up if it's a yes. All right, about half. I like that. Awesome. If I had a disability and needed accommodation, would I have a fair chance in your process? I love that. Lots of hands. Good, good, good. If there were gaps in my resume, would I have a fair chance? Probably not your fault. Usually happens down the road, but I feel you. If I wasn't in your team's networks or your recruitment networks, would I have a fair chance? Good, okay, that's a good one. If I was a woman, which I am, would I have a fair chance? If you didn't know. Okay, good, good. If I didn't work in the same industry, would I have a fair chance? Okay, all right. And last one. If I had only out-of-country experience, would I have a fair chance? Okay, you guys were honest. Yes, I love it. Thank you. And this is really exactly what I expected. And don't feel bad if you didn't raise your hand. It's the reality of our systems, it's the reality of our processes, and that's what we're trying to break down today. I'm going to ask a couple more questions. Thinking about each step of our process. So if English was not my first language, would I be sourced by your recruiters? A few less hands. Okay. Now this one's really interesting because a lot of our job descriptions are in English and our process is English. And in Canada we have French as well, but oftentimes if we're not posting in Quebec, it's not in French. And we have communities that are largely don't speak English. So we're not accessing those candidates if we're not going out there with their language spoken. So how about if I had a disability and needed accommodation? Would I be able to self-select into the process when it comes to screening? Yeah, most of you all put your hands up for good accommodation, so I would agree. I actually worked with a client, huge company, and we were going through their screening process, and they were really struggling with getting diverse candidates past the screening. So I said, let's break it down. Let's literally pretend we are applicants, and let's try and get in. And we went through sort of scenarios of, if English wasn't my first language, if I had a disability. And I was the person with a disability trying to apply. I called the accommodation phone number, and it was out of service. Can you believe that? No one had made sure that the accommodation number that was on the job descriptions and on the application site was actually the number they needed to be calling. Somewhere along the way, there was a typo made. So think about how many candidates tried to get an accommodation and couldn't get through. That's a barrier that we've lost that candidate. It was terrifying. If there were gaps in my resume, would I have a fair chance in the interview? Yeah, that's a tough one. So I have worked with a lot of hiring managers who have an old school notion that a gap in your resume means you suck. Straight up. Which blows my mind. Blows my mind. But it's something we really need to overcome, and it's something that we understand as recruiters, and we don't want to make assumptions. We want to make sure we actually get the whole story, or we just understand at least their experience. But hiring managers often see it, toss it. This person had to work every day their whole lives since they were 12, or we don't want them. Ridiculous. But it's something that we really struggle with. If I wasn't in your team's networks, would I have a fair chance when it comes to decision making? So say we have 3 candidates. Is the one from the network going to get the job? Probably. And that's not a bad thing. There's lots of data that shows referrals are good hires. And we always want to have a good referral system, absolutely. But what happens if our organization isn't diverse, our referrals aren't diverse. So we keep replicating the problem. So we really need to think about what we can do to expand those networks to get referrals who aren't like us. My LinkedIn is pretty much all people I used to work with and all people I went to school with. That's a pretty narrow network when you think about it, when it comes to diversity and all the different dimensions we're talking about. So another thing we really want to think about. And last one, this is my favorite one. If I was a woman, would I say yes to a job offer at your organization? Okay, good. Pretty good. And this is my biggest consideration when I apply for jobs and when I think about accepting an offer. I want to see women in leadership. I want to see women at the decision-making table. I want women in my interview. I want to really see that women are valued, supported, and moved up in the organization. Or I'm saying, no, there's no way I'm joining that organization. So it's another thing to think about when it comes to that yes or no piece. Okay, so every time you didn't lift your hand up for a yes, that's an established barrier in your process to a high-quality, diverse candidate. And if you aren't accessing high-quality, diverse candidates, you are not accessing all of the quality in your market, plain and simple. You are not accessing everybody in there. If you think about your market and all the different diverse groups that make up that market, if you've got barriers to 4 or 5 of them, think about you're just accessing that much of your talent pool. That's it. And you're going to get beat by other organizations that are working harder at this. So it's really important that you ask yourself these questions and you ask them about every step of your process, especially with groups that you're really trying to recruit and trying to add to your organization's makeup. and answer these questions honestly and try and turn those no's into yeses. And I will help you do that, I promise. So, the next piece is being intentional, number 2. And this one, as I mentioned, we know recruitment is reactive. We have to be. But what we really want to do is we want to find a balance between being reactive and being proactive. And finding those times in our schedules, recruitment can be very cyclical, so we can try and plan ahead to make those moments where we can balance. In one of my roles, I had very little time to source. I was really, really busy, 70 to 100 recs at a time working on, going. So what I did was I scheduled myself Find People Fridays. And every other Friday, I would block off 4 hours in my calendar, and I would not let anybody book meetings with me, I would not answer the phone, and I would just source and really try and find more candidates for my roles. Little things like that go a long way. Other things we can do, when we know we have a slow time, let's get out into the market. Let's actually leave our desks and leave our offices. Content recruiting. I don't know if you guys heard of content marketing? I hope so, yeah. It's when you share content instead of just saying, buy our product. So content recruiting is becoming really popular. So instead of just saying we have a job posting, let's go run a session with immigrant services. And let's teach them how to improve their resumes. Let's teach them how to do well in interviews. We're teaching them something and they're going to remember our brand. And we already have warmed up this cold source. We've found referrals who aren't in our network. So really finding that balance and finding time in your schedules to book these sorts of things where you can be intentional and be proactive are huge, and they're going to make it a lot easier to keep doing it. Another example, when you think about educational systems, so STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, lots of issues with women graduating from those programs. Actually, I was just having a lovely chat with a friend over there about that. So one of the things we want to think about is how do we create relationships with the schools that are actually graduating women and the schools that have women here, and let's make it easy for ourselves. So I used to work with a women in trades program at a couple colleges near me, and I literally said to them straight up, every year I need to hire 15 mechanics, around there. So every time you have a graduating class, you send me your top 5. Send me your top 5 women, I'll give them a job. And I didn't have to do anything. I literally would just know that every April I was getting an email of 5 resumes, and I was bringing them in for interviews and getting them into the process. So that made it so much easier for me because I wasn't doing Boolean searches and trying to figure out whose name was female and not, and all these things that we get ourselves in these wormholes of doing, and then our day disappears and we haven't found anybody. And then lastly is creating accountability to be proactive. And this is a really, really big piece. If we're not celebrating proactivity in recruitment, no one's going to do it. If we're not showcasing best practices of what our teams are doing, they're not going to do it again. It's all about positive reinforcement. We get back to Pavlov's dogs. We go way back in psychology. We know that if you reinforce positively positive behaviors, they're going to keep going, and they're going to get more and more intense and repeated more frequently. In one-on-ones, have conversations if you have a recruitment team, ask them what they did to be proactive, and then share it with the team. Reward them for it. Make it part of their performance review, even if it's not the structured part of it. Talk about proactivity with them, because the more you're reinforcing it, the more they're going to keep doing it, and the better they're going to get at it. And that can be really, really important to move the dial to find that best balance between proactivity and reactivity. So our last one of our foundational pieces, measuring results. So let's think about our current TA metrics. Who wants to shout out a couple for me? Time to fill, absolutely. Or time to hire. Any others? Cost per hire, huge. Quality of hire. Ooh, I like that you got that. That's a good one. Time to start was a big one that we had to make sure we got that once they accepted the offer. Open-closed ratio. I don't know if people use that still. Any others? Those are about the basics. Does anyone do hiring manager satisfaction with the recruitment team? Yeah? That's a good one. It's always fun ones to read. Retention. Are there any teams that look at retention down the way of who you hired? Okay, a couple of those. Give a little more incentive. Does anybody have a diversity metric? Couple hands? Couple hands. Don't worry, I won't make you shout it out. I'm the loud one here. I'll do most of the shouting. So the diversity metric is where things usually fall apart. Time to hire, cost per hire, open, close. That's numbers. It's easy. We know it. We know where it should be. We know where it is. But when we get to diversity, we don't really know what to do. We don't really know what to say. We know it's important. We don't know how to ask for it. We can't actively ask candidates, what diverse groups are you a part of? During the recruitment stage, we don't really know what we do. So here are some tips. And I'll give you an example before we get into these. One of my roles in recruiting, my metric was I had to present one diverse candidate on my slate to the hiring managers for every role. That was it. Didn't matter what happened afterwards. Didn't matter if they got the job or not. Didn't matter what the hiring manager did with them. And it didn't matter what diversity. I had no idea what they meant by diversity. I was like, can you unpack that a little bit for me? And they had no idea. It had come from somewhere, and everyone was just sort of hoping they had diverse slates. And then I got to my first performance review, and I was terrified because I had no idea if I was going to meet that metric. And my manager said, don't worry about it. We can't measure it because we can't know. We don't have the demographic information on all your candidates, so we can't know. And I was like, well, that's helpful. So it happens a lot. It breaks down because it's a lot of stuff we can't collect. So here are some things that we can do to actually try and start measuring diversity as a metric, especially in recruitment. First off, we need to define the term. A lot of organizations have it in their strategic plan, they've got it in their values and their mission, but it's never actually defined. And as the researcher in me, the most important thing when you share a term is defining it. In every article you write, whatever you do. So that's number one. And define it in your terms. Don't just take it off, Deloitte Berzin study or whatever you find. Define it in your terms and what it means at your organization and in your markets. And the key categories. So if you're really focusing on women in leadership, or if you're really focusing on having different generations in the organization, or you're focused on veterans, new grads, whatever it is, write it down and make sure that that's what we're focusing on. And that evolves. That's not going to be your static definition, right? As you start getting those key categories working and getting them through the process and into your pipelines, then add more and start getting more of those dimensions in. And then you can get this really rich sort of tapestry of people at your organization in all those dimensions. The next one, set the parameters for what success looks like. Just like my example at my old organization, I didn't know what it meant to be successful. And as someone who's wildly type A, that is incredibly frustrating. I did not know how to do it right. And that was really hard for me as a recruiter. So make sure you've actually said, if you present a woman at the executive level every time and they get hired, that's a check mark. Or if you bring new grads into our entry-level analyst roles from XYZ schools, that's a check mark. And it can be different at different levels. When we think about, our entry-level roles versus our executive level roles, you might have different things that you're targeting at that time. And that's okay. But your teams need to know what it is and how they can be successful, because everyone wants to do it right. They just need to know how. Next, establish your metrics around quality and capability. We are not just putting forth a diverse candidate because we have to. That is going to get us into a situation where our diverse candidates are never going to get the job because we're doing it for the sake of doing it. So every time you write in diversity as a metric, please, for my sake, instead of just writing a candidate from a diverse group, write a qualified and capable candidate from a diverse group. Because you're going to get your recruiters who at the 11th hour realize everybody in their slate looks exactly the same or comes from the same school or whatever that looks like, and they're just going to grab a random from the candidate pool and throw them in. And that's not going to get us where we want to be, where we have high-quality, diverse candidates in our organizations. And lastly, my favorite one, we're going to tell people what success looks like, but we're also going to tell them what failure looks like and what that means. We need to have both sides of the coin. Yes? Yes. So the question was, thank you, that's wonderful. The question was, are we looking at, yes, are they qualified, or no, are they qualified? Or are we looking at how qualified they are as compared to other candidates? And it's the latter. So we really want to be looking at comparatively, because when we think about screening and they meet the minimum qualifications, that's our yes or no. But candidates are much more qualified than that most of the time, right? So we want to see, now that we've got them past the yes, no, what is the quality? How qualified are these candidates, and are they qualified enough to make it through the process? Great question. Thank you. That's awesome. So we're clearly articulating the consequences. It's not, we don't want to be mean or angry about this stuff, but making sure that recruiters understand that they're going to be held accountable for this. And if they need the supports they need to get it done, awesome, we're there. But we really want them to feel empowered to be successful and to understand what it looks like to not be successful and what supports are there when that happens. So those are our first three: reducing barriers, being intentional, and measuring our results. So that's where I want everyone to start. Now we're going to get even more tangible, if you can believe it, and we're going to get into each stage of the process. So before we do that, I want you to have a quick conversation with your neighbor. And what I want you to do is I want you to share one challenge that you're having right now that brought you to this session. So what challenge are you having when it comes to recruiting diversity in your organization? Share that with your neighbor. Next, go for it, and I'll bring you back together. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's bring it back together. Ooh, that was pretty good. I was thinking I might have to do the if you hear me clap twice, like teacher stuff, but that was good. Awesome. Okay, thank you for sharing that. Hopefully you made a new friend. So what I want you to do is really focus on that as we go through the next piece. So we're going to do, the next sort of 25 minutes, we're going to nail each of these sections and what we can actually do Thursday or Monday to really move the dial on recruiting diversity. So think about that challenge in the back of your mind. Whenever I work in workshops, I always say, make it matter to you. So think about that challenge, and what I'm sharing, I want you to make it matter to you. Sound good? Yeah. Wicked. Okay. So sourcing and attraction. Let's get to our action plan. When we think about sourcing and trying to overcome this challenge that we have in our organizations, we need to think about who's in our market. So if that's, we can even look at the census data if we have to, but we really want to know who's in our talent market and what are their needs and what are their wants. It's not good enough to just post and pray. We need to, I know, right? I wish it was. What we really want to do is find out what the people in our market need and want, and then tell them we have it, so they will come and join us. And this is where things get a little sticky, and us millennials get a real bad rap. Because people use stereotypes to think about what groups need and want. So putting a ping pong table in your break room and having beer o'clock on Fridays is not getting me to join your organization. All right? Stereotypes are not helping us. So we need to use facts, we need to look at the research, and we need to really figure out exactly what the people in our markets want and need, and tell them we have it. And ask them. If you really don't know, ask them. Ask the people in your organization. Ask them why they joined, what their wants and needs were, and how the organization meets them. Next, we need to find out where these candidates are. So where are our candidates from diverse groups in our talent market? Can we find them? That's very important. Can we go out and find us? But even more important, can they find us? So can they find us? Can they find our job postings? Can they find out what they need to know to be a part of our pipeline and be in our process? So how do we do that? We can, first off, cater our messaging. We all have our generic job postings. We all have our generic job descriptions that we have to use. That's cool. We don't need to change that. But we can change what happens on the front end. We can change how we communicate out that we have positions available. And what we want to say is, I know what you want. I've heard what you need. I have it here, and you can thrive here. And that's what we want to be telling our candidates, particularly ones from diverse groups that we're having trouble engaging. And we really need to cater that. It can't just be our generic cool job alert or our usual posts. It's got to be specific and it needs to be catered. Next, we need to go to where our candidates are. And that can be physically, which is awesome, or it can be virtually. But we really want to go to where the candidates are instead of expecting them to always come to us. A great example would be what I mentioned with those sessions. So if we know we're looking for women who are coming out of STEM programs because we're struggling to find high qualified women for our engineering roles, our technical roles, then let's go to those schools and let's have open houses. Let's run sessions. Let's go to where they are so they can see us, they can meet us, they can see women talking to them about the positions, and they'll feel like they belong and that we're meeting their wants and needs. Another great example is any way that we can actually be in the space of different groups. So I worked with a client who was really struggling getting part-time people throughout the day, and they didn't know what to do, and they needed more women. These were rural areas, and they needed to lift tons of weight throughout the day. This is when I was at Coca-Cola, so they were stacking shelves, so they were hauling cases. So we needed women who wanted to do that, and we need women who would enjoy that and could work part-time. So what we did was we actually started partnerships with gyms. So we went out to all the gyms for women, and we said, hey, can we put up some flyers? Can we spend some time in the gyms and talk to your people about working with Coca-Cola? And they said, yeah, that sounds great. It's great for us. It shows that we care about our people and our patrons. And we created flyers. We catered our messaging and said, get fit while you work. We'll pay you to get fit. And all these different ways. And we had an immense response. And we were in their space. They were comfortable. We were talking to them about getting some part-time work. We were there during the day, so we knew that they were available throughout the day. So it's those little things that you can do to go where they are, and it takes some of those barriers down. And lastly, we want to create channels. And this is one that's really tough, because we don't want to say, email us if you have any questions, because then you're going to get 6,000 emails and you won't be able to answer them. But we need to find ways that we can actually create channels for candidates to ask us questions and to learn if we have their wants and needs if they aren't seeing that in the posting. A client that I worked with did a really cool thing. They didn't ask me anything on Reddit. I don't know if you guys have heard of those in AMA, on Reddit, with the CEO. So they were targeting people who were tech savvy. I have no idea how to use Reddit, so I was not their target group. Literally can't figure it out to save my life. But people who are really tech savvy, people who are in those communities, often engineers, people who are developers, coders, spend a lot of time on Reddit, and they didn't ask me anything. So people could ask the CEO any question they wanted about working at the organization. They got a huge response. But it's just creating those channels where they can actually feel like they're interacting. Twitter is awesome for that. Having an engaging Twitter account. I don't know if you guys have seen how hilarious the Wendy's Twitter account is, but really makes me laugh out loud regularly. Things like that. So we want to really try and engage with our candidates without saying, here's my personal phone number. Call me whenever you want, because it's not going to be pretty if you do that. Okay, so that's sourcing and attraction. Take a breath. Think about one thing you can do when you get back to try and move the dial a little bit when it comes to sourcing and attraction. We'll get back to this at the end, but while we're here, while we're in it, I want you to take a minute. Okay, good. Next, screening. So this is where we're saying, do I have a candidate? So this is our yes, no. Is this candidate qualified? But what happens is first the candidate has to say yes or no. So before we get a chance to say yes or no, the candidate has to self-select into the process and say, this is a job I'm qualified for, this is a place where I will thrive, and this will meet my wants and needs. That happens before we even see them. So that's something we really need to think about and figure out how to answer that question. And then once they've said, yes, I want to be a part of this process, we want to make sure that if they're qualified, they'll be selected in and moved through. So how do we do that? First, we audit our job postings. Can we just have a collective sigh for how SHITTY some job postings are? Like, I have seen some bad ones, and I have posted some terrible ones. Some of my favorites. Candidate needs 6 years of IT experience, 3 years of project management experience, 2 years of experience working with specific systems, 1 year in a leadership capacity, and 8 years working in a matrix organization. Candidates are too busy doing mental math to figure out if they can apply for this freaking job or not. And how do we know that that exact combination of experience is going to lead us to our best candidate? We have no idea. Nobody's doing the regression analysis to figure out if 6 years is more predictive than 5 years on the job. So let's try and just make it a little more generic. Some of my other favorites, adding 2, 3, or 4, or 1 next to the job title. And we see the 2 lines or the 3 lines or the Roman numerals. No one knows what that is. Can people even read Roman numerals anymore? I don't think they're teaching that in school. I don't think that's pretty old school. One organization I worked at, it meant the size of the building you were working in. How is that relevant to the job? Oh, I'm in Roman numeral size 4. It's very important. I'm much more qualified than the people in Roman numeral 2, if you're wondering. Like, it's ridiculous. Jargon. Can we all just assume that everyone's a freaking self-starter? I don't want to see it. I don't want to see it anymore. No one knows what that is. No one knows what self-starter means. To me, it's like my truck. I can turn it on from inside while I'm sleeping so it warms up when it's cold. That's what I think of. So let's please think about what we can do to our job postings within our bounds to make them say, this is a quick description of the job. This is what you'll do if you're successful. This is what you'll learn if you're successful. And this is what you have. And there are some companies out there that even say, if you don't have this, that's okay. If you think this is something that you truly are qualified for, apply and we'll let you know. That's all you need. Simple. Next, simplifying the application process. Something like having an accommodation phone number that is in service would simplify the application process. I'm sure a lot of you have used some systems, I won't name names, that ask you to upload your resume and also submit a full experience profile that takes 45 minutes to do. And then they don't allow for gaps in your resume, so you have to make up stuff to make it all work, or you can't get through, you keep getting the red stars and you have no idea what the hell you're doing wrong. Things like that we need to simplify, simplify, simplify. We want them to try when they're applying, but let's try and make it an easy process so that they really feel like they belong and they can get into the process. And lastly, addressing our screening bias. So once they actually make it through and they've successfully said, yes, I want to be here, I want to be part of this, we want to make sure that we keep them in the process. So obviously our recruiters are a big part of that. Everybody has a bias, and someone yesterday at their talk, which I loved, said, if you have a brain, you have a bias. That's reality. So we really want to make sure that we're doing what we can to address that. So are we training? Are we using technology to help us? Are we using AI to help us sort our resumes? To take away that bias that inherently sneaks in when we're looking through resumes. So that's our screening piece. Take a breath. I can't wait for you guys to go back and fix your job postings. I'm so excited. I'm so excited. Think about something you can do that you have control over that you can do now. Question, yes? Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes.
And then they say, and you are conscientious and hardworking.
Mm-hmm. Self-starter.
Self-starter.
Yes. I think they're good in moderation. I think sometimes it's, a full page that says we are and you are, and we haven't even gotten to what the job is yet. Which, that's a lot of reading to do for somebody. I think it's important if it's not a well-known brand, especially if you're not a company that people really know, to give them a quick, sentence or two of what you do and what you are. And when you say who you are, we get into those situations where, we're describing the person who left the job, basically, and then everyone else is like, I'm not that. I can't do it. So I would say who we are is really important, but then saving the sort of qualifications at the end and saying, if you don't have these, it's okay. If you feel like you can do this job, let us know. Great question, though. I've seen that a lot. Mm-hmm. Yes, sometimes they seem very salesy. I agree. And pandering a little bit, right? Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's all about being concise and exciting them. Thank you. Great question. Okay, let's get to selection. So we want to think about how our candidates will experience the selection process. Will they be evaluated fairly? And probably more importantly for our candidate experience is, will they be treated fairly? I had a hiring manager that I worked with who was infamous in the organization for being terrible to women in interviews. And everyone was just fine with it. We knew. We couldn't stop him. He'd been there for 20 years. Nothing we could do about it. So every time I presented a woman, they came back to me saying they had a horrendous candidate experience. But I had a metric that I needed them in the process. And it was awful. It was such an unpleasant experience for everybody. But it happens more often than not. Everyone's got that, oh, you know, him in that department. We know what they're like. So we really want to think about how we can create our process to treat them fairly and evaluate them fairly. So what can we do? Be systematic. As data people, we're all about being systematic. The more of a process we have to follow, the less chance there is for bias to sneak in. So we really want to make sure we have a clearly defined process, and we want everybody to be trained in it. This is my number one pain point. Recruitment knows exactly what's going on. They know the process. They know everything like the back of their hands. It gets in the hands of a hiring manager, and it's an absolute disaster. Or it gets to interview 2, and it's even more of a disaster. And then it just turns into unmitigated chaos, and we don't know what to do. And the recruiter's left picking up the pieces. So we really want to make sure we're training all stakeholders. And it's as easy as including it in onboarding. And saying, you know, as part of your onboarding, we're always trying to find things to do to onboard people. So as part of your onboarding, you're going to learn about what recruitment means here and why it's important to us to have diverse candidates, to have a positive experience, and here's how we're going to help you. Little things like that go a long way. And lastly, establishing consequences. I've said it already. I want to say it again. Consequences are really, really important for all stakeholders. And there's one trick that I use when I'm talking to people who are actually doing face-to-face interviews. And I tell them, has anyone heard of the STAR method? STAR method, so it's a way to answer behavioral interview questions. So you share the situation you were in, your task, your actions, and your result. I challenge the interviewers to only record the STAR. So I say, when you ask a question, I want you to write down STAR in the open space. The only things you write down about this candidate are the situation they told you, the task they told you, the actions they told you, and the result. That's it. You don't write if they smell bad. You don't write if their hair's funny. You don't write if you like them better than Joe or not. You just write down what you heard. And then that helps them focus on what's actually happening in the interview and not their bias. And it also keeps you out of legislative issues if some legal action comes your way. And it gets them to ask better probing questions. Because if they see the A section is pretty empty, they're going to say, tell me what the actions that you took in this situation. And it's a simple little tweak, but it makes their life easier because they don't interview every day. They don't really have this expertise. They might do it once every 6 months. So the little tricks that we can do to actually help them and show them we're helping them help us get away from scenarios where we have to actually enforce consequences. All right, so that's selection. Nice and easy. Think about something you can do to move the dial. Decision making. So this is where I like to call it, will our candidates survive the decision process? I'm sure it's happened to a lot of you, but you have the best candidate and you're so excited and they just get shot right out of the decision process and you're not sure why. So we need to ask, is getting this far good enough for our high quality diverse candidates? Like the metric I had to uphold, it was good enough that I just got them to the interview stage. Not ideal, but that's where I was. And where are they going to be a diversity hire? My least favorite thing. But when we get here, if the sourcing wasn't working, if the screening wasn't working, if the selection wasn't working, we might have a lower qualified or an unqualified diverse candidate. And they might get hired because we have a metric we have to hit. And that's not good for anybody. We're putting an unqualified person in a role, and we're setting them up for failure. And we're setting ourselves up to get crap if it doesn't work out. So we want to make sure, obviously, at this point, we've got a high-quality, diverse candidate in the pipeline, and we want to make sure they're not just getting hired for the sake of it. So how do we do that? We challenge and we educate. So we challenge our hiring managers. Who here has heard, I don't know what you're talking about, I just hire the best person? But every person on their team looks like they've literally been photocopied from them and put next to them on the page? Yeah. I'm like, sure, you hire the best. Great. So we need to define best. So we need to talk to them about what it means to be the best candidate in the interviews before they go in. Remind them of the qualifications that they're looking for. Remind them of what they need on their team. Next, we need to focus on capability. So when we are challenging, we're not saying, oh, you've got to hire this person because they're from a diverse group. We're saying this person is the best qualified, and this is why. And this is what you told me in our intake meeting, what you wanted. And this person meets all of that. So we're going to them with data and objective information, and that's the best way that we can make sure our high-quality, diverse candidates get hired. And lastly, my favorite one, we want to always focus on culture add, not culture fit. The word fit is an easy way to excuse our biases. We say this person just didn't fit, or this person was a better fit. It's nothing. It's not telling us anything. So when I think about my thesis and I think about generating that good task conflict, we want to think of someone who's going to add to our culture, who's going to make our culture better, make our culture more diverse and better at decision making and more innovative and all those things that we know diversity produces. So I want to challenge everybody when you talk to hiring managers and they say, well, this person is a fit or not a fit, say, but are they going to add? Are they going to add to your team? Are they going to add to our culture? And that's how we change that sort of easy excuse for bias when we have two qualified candidates and we just pick the one we like most and say they fit better. That's how we fight our bias and we say, let's look at somebody who's going to add. Lastly, once we've gone through the painstaking process of getting our candidate this far, we want to make sure they're going to say yes to an offer. So we want to go back to what we thought about earlier in sourcing. Are we meeting their wants and needs? And do they feel like they're going to belong here? And that's where inclusion really comes in, and that's where it sort of hits its stride when they join the organization. So what we're going to do, first off, we're going to go back to what I like to call our fact find. Way earlier in our recruitment process, somebody somewhere along the way had a conversation with the candidate and said, what do you want in your career? What interests you about this position? What interests you about our organization? What do you like about your current job? What don't you like about your current job? Why are you looking for a new job? All of these screening questions that we ask just sort of stay in the little screening hole and we never look at them again. Open that up again. Look at their cover letter. Find out why they're here. Why have they made it this far? Why are they invested? And that's going to let us cater our offer presentation. We're creatures of habit. We're creatures of process. We usually just give them a call or bring them in and go through the highlights of the offer letter. I want to challenge that. I want to change that. Tell them what they want. If they want flexibility, if they're a new mom who's coming back to work and needs the supports available, if they're a new grad and they need growth and experience, that's what we're focusing on. We're not telling them about their 401k and our RSP matching. Like, yeah, that's great, but let's excite them. If they're choosing between offers, this is what they're going to remember. They're not going to remember that phone interview you did with them 3 weeks ago. So go back to that and really show them, we have what you want, we have what you need, and we're going to move you towards the career you want. We're going to take you away from the things you don't like, and we're going to move you towards the things you like. And I tell you, it makes a world of a difference, because they're probably getting the generic crap from the other competitors. So when they get a catered offer presentation that really speaks to them, it's going to go a long way in getting that yes. And lastly, we want to share resources with these candidates. So if we know we've got a great volunteer program where candidates are allowed to volunteer in the community and give back to things that are really important to them, and that's something that they mentioned, that on their resume they do a lot of volunteering, let's tell them about it. Let's share that resource. If you have an employee resource group, that would cater to what they need. If you have a business resource group, if people are allowed to start their own ERGs or BRGs, if you have a mentorship program, whatever that looks like, do a little more in that offer presentation than just giving them what their salary is and their start date. So, we've gone through all 5, and we have 9 minutes to go. So, what I want everyone to do is to take 2 minutes, chat with your neighbor again, and I want you to decide one thing for each of these sections. Before you do that, I want you to make sure that what you've decided is doable. So if you want to hire a sourcing specialist for all dimensions of organizational diversity, but you don't have the resources, it's not doable. And to make sure it's replicable. So something you can replicate as much as you want, and it's something that's measurable. So I'm going to give you 2 minutes, and then we're going to come back together and finish up. Go for it. And if there's one part of the process that you touch more, focus on that. Awesome. Hopefully those discussions can continue as well over a drink tonight, a well-earned drink. So, some key takeaways. First off, we always want to remember to reduce barriers, be intentional, and measure our results. We always want to make sure we're addressing the strategic level, but we want to get down to the tactical level, get down and dirty with the tactics. If change doesn't happen at every step of the way, it's not going to be as effective. Remember that funnel. We need to get all the barriers out of that funnel so we can end up with a high-quality, diverse candidate. And lastly, if every step is optimized, our high-quality, diverse candidates will be successful more consistently. So I want to leave you with one more story. Several hundred people came together on Tuesday, June 19th at 4 o'clock and decided that they had work to do and decided that they were going to commit to make recruiting a better place for every candidate, no matter where they come from, so no one ever feels like they can't be their true selves or they won't be understood. No one is told that they just can't cut it in the career they've chosen, and no one has a bad hiring experience. And with that, we can all expand our worlds. Thank you so much for coming today. Thank you. You were awesome. You were awesome, awesome, awesome.